series in February leading into the first week of March into spring break called The Altar of Intimacy. And then we concluded that series and then kept going with the series. Just a few altars that didn't make the primary body of the teaching series. We just said, we've got to linger a little bit longer. And so we're going to wrap it up today with one more altar. I want to introduce it this way. I have felt in my adult life at times the longing for someone else to adult in my life. Have you ever just said, boy, where's somebody else that can make these decisions for me? What? Can't I just take a day, a week off and not have to adult? I want to outsource my decisions and my responsibilities. I want to outsource it. Well, there's good news on the horizon. There is good news on the horizon because an organization called OpenAI has built an app called ChatGPT. It can, and it is scaring some, as they began to use it. It was released last November, free for the public. You can use this robotic, how do you describe it? I have read, obviously this isn't my area of expertise, but I've done my reading in the last 3 or 4 weeks. How can you describe this virtual organism that answers your questions and drafts emails and holds conversation and can explain code in different languages, programming languages, and can translate natural language into code and more. And then some bright mind up at the University of Pennsylvania's Wharton School found that the artificial intelligence-driven chatbot GPT-3 was able to pass the final exam of a school's Master of Business Administration, an MBA. The final exam passed with a B. The professor said it might have been a B-, but we'll give it a B. So the rest, they say, it is nearing a place where some of us no longer have to adult. We can sit there and have some other virtual adult take over our lives. They write, based on the exam that this virtual organism took, it said has remarkable ability to automate some of the skills of highly compensated knowledge workers in general, and specifically the knowledge workers in jobs held by MBA graduates, including analysts, managers, and consultants. That is, this is not Siri, where you ask a question and it searches the web for an answer. This actually, and this is my best technical terminology for what we're talking about. This has the ability to almost reason. So there's debate. Well, of course there's debate. There's conversation saying, wait a minute, this speaking style is way too coherent, and the topical response style makes it difficult to distinguish from human responses. In fact, speaking to a colleague who said he called a restaurant to make a reservation. And when he got to the restaurant, they were ready for him with his reservation, but then admitted that they had never answered his call, that they had this. Answer his call, discuss his reservation with him, and communicate to them his reservation. It was no human being, and he never knew. They say that about 10%, right now, that's 10% of the people working on this are scared that they've crossed a line. 10%. 1 out of every 10 of these bright minds that are putting their energy into this are scared they've crossed the line. It reminded me of a book written by A.J. Jacobs. I'll put his author, he's the author of the book, A Year of Living Biblically. But he wrote a very long, lengthy article back in 2005 when he outsourced his life to some businesses that take care of, that are willing to do this for you, based primarily in India. He used them as his personal assistants to answer his emails, to read to his children, goodnight stories, even to arguing with his wife. It was outsourced. When it came to conversations with his parents, they called his parents and had very delightful conversations on behalf of their son. He did this as a bit of an experiment, and he wrote then the article entitled My Outsourced Life. He said it felt freeing for the time. I don't know that his wife or his children or his parents agreed. I want to take you to a narrative in 1 Kings, entitled this message, a word that rolls around in my head, a word that I think should be on more of our tongues, simply cogent. This question comes from 1 Kings chapter 18, cogent. What is cogent? 1 Kings chapter 18, we'll start mid-chapter, verse 19. It's the story of Elijah. Elijah the prophet was working to call God's people back to be faithful to God. That was the task he invested his life into, confronting King Ahab, who was, of course, married to the wicked Queen Jezebel, leading the people of Israel astray from worshiping God and to worshiping the false idols of the cultures around them. Because of the audacity that Ahab and Jezebel had, Elijah had to match with boldness for God. After a drought, Elijah, compelled by the Spirit of God, challenged Ahab to meet him, and that's where we pick up the story. 1 Kings chapter 18 and verse 19. Now he said, put it on the screen for you, of course. Now summon the people from all over Israel. Operative language here. Listen to it. He says, I want everybody there. This is for everyone to meet me on Mount Carmel. Bring the 450 prophets of Baal and the 400 prophets of Asherah who eat at Jezebel's table. Bring all 850 of the prophets of Baal and Asherah together combined. Meet me on top of Mount Carmel, but I don't want to just confront the prophets. I want every Israelite there. In this narrative, you will find that Elijah, by the Spirit of God, is calling every man, woman, and child to make a decision, a cogent decision, an absolute decision. So there he was with 850 prophets, and Elijah came to meet, representing himself as the only one for God. He was in the minority. History tells us Mount Carmel was instrumental in the cultures of that day. I want you to read through the very intentional language I am going to use to extrapolate the story from Mount Carmel to our lives. Cultures of every color, the Egyptians, the Phoenicians, the Canaanites, they all gathered to worship on Mount Carmel. It was known as a center of sun worship. Elijah said, I want to meet where the question of worship is for our world. And I want to confront the cultures that say it's exciting. Israel was confronted with this constant question of look at what the Romans are doing. Look at what the Canaanites are doing. Look at what the Phoenicians are doing. Look at what the Greeks are doing. Everybody's doing it. It must be acceptable in our culture. And beloved, don't tell me that you haven't had that line of reasoning roll through your head. It must be okay if I see it in the church, if I see it around the world. Elijah says, I want to challenge the people of God to a decision in the midst of their question of what everybody else is doing. And so he took them to Mount Carmel. Said, I want to meet you there. All of Israel. Why? Because everyone has to make their own decision. Listen to me, young people and old people. Some of us, adults, have just delayed the decision making. We have said, well, when we grow up, when we get out of high school, then I'll become serious. When we get out of college, no, when we have kids, and sometimes it happens. But some of us, decade after decade, have been pushing the decision down the road. You say, I make decisions all the time. I'm a rather successful person. I hold down a job. I have a family. I own my house. Good on you. But yet you live in a life that waffles, and that's where we're going. Don't let me get ahead of the story. Here we go. Chapter 18, verse 21. Elijah went before the people. All of Israel was gathered there. In the center of what culture says was acceptable, Elijah went before the people and said, how long will you waver between your two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. If Baal is God, follow him. Elijah's challenge to the people was, you can't keep putting on, you can't outsource this. You can't ask for a virtual assistance. This is your decision to make. It's your moment to decide today, how long are you going to go this way and go that way? You see, Israel had not forsaken God in the sense, in their perspective, they had only added other elements to their worship of God. It said, let's just do plurality. But on God's perspective, that was as the same as forsaking him. How long are you going to mix your allegiance to multiple gods? How long are you going to give part of your life to the God of success, or the God of entertainment, or the God of materialism, or the God? How long are you going to allow the cultures around you to provide you with gods? And so Elijah confronts every last Israelite, beloved. That's a message to the people of God. That's a message to the church of God. This isn't even to the Phoenicians or to the Greeks or to the Canaanites. It's to the Israelites. And Elijah says, how long are you going to waver? That's the NIV. The New King James reads falter. Oh, here and there. How long are you going to allow the addictions to hold you back? The challenge was put out. Let's build some altars. Let's put a sacrifice on the altars, and the God that answers by fire, then we will know. Then we will know that we should and only give our allegiance to one. Do you know what? This is a part, until this week, I had never realized. The 850 prophets, the prophets of Baal and Asherah, agreed to it because logically it makes sense that you would not try to worship a plurality of gods. They actually agreed to it. Okay, if they had followed their cultural reasoning, they would have said, there's no contest. We don't care. You can worship as many gods as you want, because that was the reasoning of the culture. But when Elijah stood up and said, this doesn't make sense, you can't really do that, 850 false prophets said, that makes sense, let's do our thing. And they begin to dance. The hours away, 9 hours, these 850 prophets danced their afternoon away, cutting themselves and each other with spears and swords until the blood flowed. That was the part of the expectation. These gods desire our blood. They take our life. Oh, beloved, do you hear the gods of culture that suck the life out of you? And then you wonder why you live in depression and anxiety, because the false gods of culture have stolen your life. Tim Keller, I'm going to put the same line I did just several weeks ago from his book. And don't read this book if you prefer to waver and falter between two opinions. He says they sacrificed everything. He's speaking of the modern God. They have sacrificed everything to the God of success, but it wasn't enough. It will never be enough. You will never be successful enough if you serve the God of success. You will never be rich enough. You'll never have enough stuff. They sacrificed everything to the gods of success, but it wasn't enough. In ancient times, the deities were bloodthirsty and hard to appease, and they still are. You can't appease them. These 850 danced their afternoon away. If we could just get them, if we could just. Let me break away from those 850 for just a moment and talk about our lives. It's exhausting to live captive to the gods of this world. It's exhausting. It wears you out, creates anxiety, discouragement, depression. It's exhausting to live captive to the gods of this world. If you are worn out today, ask yourself what gods you are dancing your life to. And then let me warn you. Many false gods are tied to something spiritual. These 850 prophets were not aspiritual. They were very spiritual. But they made a god that was not meant to be. And some of you are living for an issue. This issue is a do or a don't. It's a breaking point for me. And the issues in the church can become your God. Don't just think that the issues of the world are tied to Disney and to Apple. They're tied to even the spiritual. 9 hours, they finally become exhausted and collapse. You can't keep going forever worshiping a false god. They will take your life. And then Elijah steps forward. This humble but bold man. It's in verse 30. He steps forward. Then Elijah said to all the people, "Come near me. Come near to me." And they came to him, and he repaired the altar of the Lord, which had been torn down. He repaired it. He says, come near to me. Where was he? Elijah was at the altar. And Elijah knew that covenant altar, that covenant space of personal worship, of family worship, of corporate worship as a church community. Those are the altars in which God calls us to meet him. And Elijah knew that if they could meet him there, then they would have the opportunity to again enter into a covenant with God. That's why your personal worship and your family worship and your corporate worship is so important, because it's an altar, a covenant space with God. And Elijah had a message for the people to restore obedience and faithfulness to the worship of a faithful God. The altar that was for God had been broken down. Nobody kept it up, because why? He restores it. And then, in an act to convince even the skeptic, he had barrel after barrel of water in one of the worst droughts they had experienced. He had water poured over the altar. And then a prayerful Elijah bent low in this covenant space with God. And he says, "God, we need to see you here. We need to see you." God was faithful. He was faithful to a faithful follower. God answered with fire, taking everything, the water, the stones, and of course the offering. It even took the dust. Whoosh. I want to remove all questions. The New Testament declares that Elijah was a man with like passions as we are. That's good news, but you want to know what the good news today is? Is that if Elijah was like us, then maybe his experience can be like ours. Why not? Why can't, if we're willing to meet God and to be challenged to make a decision and not to falter, not to waver between two decisions, why wouldn't God answer in the same cogent way to a people who are willing to be cogent in their decisions? But as long as we are willing to be in the exact opposite of cogent, to waver and to falter, then don't expect God to be able to answer any other way. What is so powerful about this story? With Elijah's work to call people back to faithfulness to God, it happened at an altar, a covenant meeting place with God, personal, family, corporate altars. His voice, why do you falter? Why do you waver between two opinions? Oh, people of God, why and how long are you going to do it? His voice still echoes across time and today. The final prophecy of the Old Testament. Let me put this on the screen for you. You know what it is. It's in the book of Malachi, chapter 4. Behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the coming of the great and dreadful day of the Lord. In that final generation that is ready to meet Jesus when he comes, I will send it. And he will turn the hearts of the fathers to the children and the hearts of the children to their fathers, lest I come and strike the earth with a curse. I'm going to send you the message of Elijah. This was the pinnacle of Elijah's ministry, right here on top of Mount Carmel, in the midst of a culture that said, come on, just accept everything. Elijah said, we can't play the game of going back and forth. We cannot do it. And he called Israel to a decision. And the last prophecy of the Old Testament is that message and that decision will come to the final generation. We're living in moments of Earth's history in which we can no longer outsource to India or to a virtual assistant our decision. We cannot waver. It's us, you and I, that must make this decision. This last December, just a few months ago, I shared with you a few weeks ago, on a Monday night, God tapped me on the shoulder. It put me in the fetal position. If you saw what God was talking to me about, some of you might reason, are you serious? That's what you're talking about? That's nothing. That's just normal life. God tapped me and said, Michael, I need you not to waver. You're distracted. You are wasting moments of your life. Not hours, but just moments. But I'm counting the moments, Michael. And every thought, Michael, must be brought to the obedience of Christ. Every thought. And so criticism, slander, lust, white lies, selfishness, I'm talking about all of that. It's got to go. How long are you going to waver between two opinions? A.W. Tozer, his book, Voice of a Prophet, I put his words on the screen about Elijah. The secret of Elijah's courage was that he had been with God and stood in his presence. He'd already been to his personal altar. And so when he walked into the corporate altar on top of Mount Carmel, he could stand in God's presence. To stand in God's presence is to prepare a man to stand before anyone else without fear. Here was a man who found something that lasted. I stand before God, he says. Beloved, we've taken things secondhand. We have floated through, some of us, our adult lives, and I'm going to put off those decisions. I'm not going to get serious about this until I absolutely need to How you live today is how you will live tomorrow, beloved. Stop outsourcing. Stop delaying. A true encounter with God. We cannot take things secondhand. We have never had a true encounter with God, and we cannot relate our religion to our lives. If you don't have that encounter, if you don't meet God at the altar, of course, religion will not be practical. It will seem extreme or legalistic. But when you meet God at the altar, you'll see as he stretches out his scarred hands and invites you to take a step forward with courage to stand where others are not standing, you will see. It will make sense. And to know that we have been playing in the mud when God offers something so much better. Just this last week in my personal time at the altar with Jesus, he gave me this paragraph, and I've skipped as much as I can. You'll see the dots, but here it goes. True religion. There's false religion. That's the faltering, the wavering. True religion brings man into harmony with the laws of God, physical, mental, and moral. Now listen to it. Listen to what the effects of this will be. Why wouldn't we choose this? Just ask yourself the question as you listen to this and read this with me. It teaches self-control, serenity, temperance, lightens the burdens of anxiety and care, fills the heart with joy and contentment in the highest or the lowest lot, tends directly to promote health, to lengthen life, and to heighten our enjoyment of all its blessings. It opens to the soul a never-failing fountain of happiness. What part of that sounds legalistic and repulsive? Would that all who have not chosen Christ might realize that he has something vastly better to offer them than they are seeking for themselves. Oh, beloved. Eye hath not seen, nor ear heard, nor has entered into the mind or the heart of man what God has prepared for you now, if we will only follow him and stop the wavering between two opinions. And that little prophecy at the end of the Old Testament guarantees that the question of Elijah will return in the final generation. It's for you and it's for me. And Elijah's voice still calls. It still calls. There's one more aspect of this. As a preacher, with very few times left in this pulpit, I want to feed two birds with one scone. Apparently that's the updated version. I call on the name of the God of Elijah, that you, in your life, cease to halt between two opinions. Don't put it off another day. Don't outsource it. The second then that you make that decision, that you are all in for the cause of Jesus, do you know what happens? A personal decision then calls you to go. It does. Two exhibits. And I got to tell you a story and I'll be done. Exhibit number 1 from the book of Psalms, Psalm 51 and verse 10. Create in me is the prayer of David. Create in me, O God, a pure heart and renew a steadfast spirit within me. Do not cast me from your presence or take your Holy Spirit from me. Restore to me the joy of your salvation and grant me a willing spirit to sustain me. This is David's prayer. I want to be Israel on top of Mount Carmel. He says, I want a new heart. I want a steadfast spirit. I want to be all in for the cause of Jesus. Do you know the very next verse, verse 13 of Psalm 51? I'll put it on the screen for you. And the underlining is mine. Then I will teach. I will go as a missionary. I will teach transgressors your ways so that the sinners will turn back to you. I will go as I stand steadfast before you as Elijah did. Then the next call on my life, the next decision I must make, I must go for you. And I wonder if there is a dearth of missionaries in the Church of Christ because there is a lack of those who have made a steadfast decision. Then I will teach. Then I will go for you. Then I will be a missionary. I will go. On Fridays, I will go with HMS. I will go. On Sabbaths, I will go. Exhibit B, as it were, Isaiah chapter 6 and verse 6. Put it on the screen for you as well. Then one of the seraphim, one of the highest ranking of the angels, flew to me with a live coal in his hand, which he had taken with tongs from where? Where did the angel take it from? From the altar. From that experience, that covenant moment and space with God, the angel takes this coal, and with it, he touched my mouth, and he said, "See, this has touched your lips. Your guilt is taken away. Your sin is atoned for. You are standing now faithful before God." What's the very next thing that happens? Then I heard a voice of the Lord saying, "Whom shall I send? Whom shall I send, and who will go for us?" And Isaiah knew that as he had been faithful to making the decision and to be atoned for and right before God, the very next thing he was to do was to go for the cause of Jesus. That's the sequence. The seraphim, the highest ranking of the angel, comes to the altar, touches your life. Your life is touched. You make a firm decision that you will serve the cause of Jesus and only Jesus. The very next thing that you embrace happens to be the motto of this church: each one reaching one. And I found it true. Every time I go out, I am reaffirmed in my own personal commitment with Jesus. Every time I give a Bible study, I am reaffirmed that it's true. The Bible study is for me as it is for you. Last week, I had the privilege to visit Guam and Palau, out in the far west of the Pacific. Sits directly north of Australia and Papua New Guinea, east of the Philippines. I landed there to speak for a camp meeting, a 4-day camp meeting. With a heavy heart, knowing that just to the west of them, out in the islands of the Philippines, a missionary pilot who had grown up in Northern California, a nurse, a missionary nurse, Daniel being the pilot, Janelle. Let me put Daniel's picture on the screen just to honor. And there's Daniel to the pilot controls. And then Janelle, put her picture up. That's the second picture. There you go. The nurse riding. And the Yellow Bee helicopter transporting as missionaries the sick and the hurting and the dying. Disappeared from radar on February 28 while transporting a patient in the southwest region of the Philippines. Thousands of hours and thousands of square miles have been invested in searching for them, but they found only just a few items they believe to be from the helicopter. I took a picture. Let me put this picture on the screen. I stood with a group of student missionaries on the island of Palau. Some who had been there a year, some had been there 6 years, investing their life into letting young and old know about the hope that we have in the first coming of Jesus and hope that we have in the second coming of Jesus. As I spent my time with these student missionaries, some from Andrews University, some from Southern University, some from just spread out around the globe had gathered there to serve Jesus. And I walked away with this overwhelming thought: these men and these women, young as they are, have one purpose in their life. Well, I say a dual purpose in their life: to bring honor to God and to bless other humans. That's it. That's all they existed for. Campion, we need more, not less, missionaries. A line shared to me, so I was talking to these missionaries, they said, never pity missionaries. Don't pity us. We have the highest privilege in serving the God of the universe full time with our lives. Don't pity us. Don't pity our poverty. Don't pity our separation from family. Don't pity us. I discovered as I talked to them this last week that these young men and young women have a sacred mindset. And I use that in all the fullness of its meaning. A sacred mindset. A righteous mindset. We were standing globally, relatively close to where two missionaries are still today missing in action. And these missionaries were faithful at their posts. And as I spoke to them, a line that I'd heard, a motto in the Coast Guard, came rolling through my head. I'll put it on the screen for you. You have to go out, but you don't have to come back. That's the mentality. That's the sacred mindset of a missionary. Hey, what about? That's the mindset of a fallen angel. The mindset of a missionary is a sacred one that says, I'm going to go, and I'm going to go, and I'm going to go with my life. And if I don't come back, that's God's business. That's the three worthies. That's the Esther before the king. If I perish, I perish, but I must go. Oh, beloved. I stood with these young men and women, and I asked them in the camp meeting during the worship service to stand, and we applauded them. Because if there's anyone worth getting support, I told them, you're my heroes. You go out. A young lady that was part of my congregation in Michigan is one of those missionaries serving. She's been there 6 years. I said, what about your family back in Berrien Springs? She says, they're doing good. We stay in touch. Did you see them this year? No. I hope to this summer. But I'm here to serve. There was also another meaningful moment to me in what has now been made a beautiful story, filmed now as a story of forgiveness, Return to Palau. I stood in front of the house, the very house where former classmates of mine in college, the DePaiva family, had lived. When a man assaulted and murdered both the father, the mother, and the 11-year-old son, and then took captive their daughter and assaulted her. A day later, throwing her over, and I stood beside this narrow highway. I stood beside the guardrail that he pulled over and so hellishly threw her body over the embankment. She came to and climbed her way back up to the highway, raising her hand just high enough for a couple to find her and take her back to their house. I stood before the house where they had given their all, and I stood beside the highway. They gave their lives as this is the testimony of the brother. They gave their lives as missionaries. A worthwhile investment. A famous explorer and missionary, David Livingstone, died where now is Zambia, around May 1 of 1873. After his death, his team embalmed him, and in preparation to send him back to England, they carried his body to the coast, but they took his heart and buried it underneath a tree, claiming he gave his heart to Africa. It belongs here. 9 months later, his body finally arrived in England, April 18 of 1874, where he was buried in the Westminster Abbey. But his heart remains buried in African soil. So here's my appeal. Who's going to go? Who's going to go, beloved? Here at Campion, from this church and from this campus, is there one who would stand with me and say, I will go. I will go. Is there one? Is there one who will stand? God bless you. Is there any others who feel the tap of God on your heart? I'm going to invite our pianist just to the piano here. Do you feel called to go? Maybe it's not to Palau, to the Philippines, or to Africa, but it's to your neighborhood. Will you stand? Will you go for the cause of Jesus? Will you go? Our hymn today, before the musicians come up, just Sherry, just go ahead and start on this. Our hymn today is Redeemed, written by Fanny Crosby. Redeemed, how I love to proclaim it. Redeemed by the blood of the Lamb. When you're redeemed and you meet God at the altar on top of Mount Carmel and make the decision that the cultures of this world, the Phoenicians, the Canaanites, the Egyptians, the Romans, the Greeks, will no longer have influence in your life, but that you will serve only the God of Israel. When you make that decision, His Spirit will flow through you and you will go. You will go to your neighbors and to your work associates, to your classmates and to your friends, to your family, and maybe even Palau and the Philippines and beyond. Let's go. But I want to make one more invitation, and I will make this invitation as long as I have an opportunity here. I want to make the invitation that maybe there's someone in here that has said, yeah, I want to go, but to be honest, I haven't even made the full commitment to follow Jesus. I've never been baptized, or I have, and then I wandered away, and I need to be rebaptized because I've wandered away from my decision, and I need to make that full decision again today. As we sing this hymn, I'm going to stand right here. On May 6 and May 13, we have this tank full already, a month away from now. Maybe you're not ready by then. That's okay. But we will have the opportunity, if you know God has called you to be baptized, to make a public and a firm decision on top of Mount Carmel that you will only serve Him. You will no longer waver or falter between two decisions. I'd invite you to meet me here, while the rest of us join together in singing, Redeemed, how I love to proclaim it. The deacons will at the same time collect our tithes and our offerings.
Redeemed, how I love to proclaim it. Redeemed by the blood of the Lamb. Redeemed through His infinite mercy.
Now to him who is able to keep you from stumbling and to present you faultless before the presence of his glory with exceeding joy. To God our Savior, who alone is wise, be glory and majesty, dominion and power, both now and forevermore. Amen.
Amen.